Hello to all tuning in. Thank you so much for joining us on another episode of ANR Conversations Between Malaysians. This is a podcast run by myself, Ryan, as well as my good friend Adi Putra.
All right, today we will be tackling on the issue of graft and patronage politics, two very pertinent issues which has plagued the country for many, many decades. And we would like to give our opinions as youths to how we perceive this whole attitude has precipitated within the Malaysian political sphere, its consequences to the present day, and perhaps maybe even give a prediction to what might happen in the future should these attitudes continue to prevail in Malaysia. But first, we would like to give a short plug to a certain special group of youths who will be entering a digital forum and in the capacity of parliamentarians as member of parliament. This is under the program of Parliament Digital. So if any of you are interested in to know more, we recommend you look at their website, which is parliament.digital. So it's spelled PARLIMEN dot DIGITAL. So please tune in because there are a lot of young people that are very active in the aspect of policymaking, and they've devoted a lot of time to make sure that this whole initiative would pay off. And also, we can prove to the real Malaysian parliament that parliamentary sittings can be done within a digital environment.
Yeah, yes.
If they can do it, so can the real parliamentarians. There's no excuse right there. And without further ado, let's get into our episode.
All right. So let us start by talking about the recent issues that we've seen um, unraveled in the past few weeks, and the biggest story of them all would be the acquittal of Musa Aman for all the graft charges that he's been placed under. So, what do you think of this, Adi, coming from Sabah?
I mean, Musa Aman's case was charged when the Pakatan Harapan government was in charge. At the same time, once you see the Perikatan National government was placed into power, they started going after warisan individuals such as Peter Anthony. So I don't think this is a case of who is innocent or who is not. I believe that a lot of our politicians have a lot of dealings under the ground. Whether or not it is savory, that is up to the courts and personal opinion to decide. But I feel it is a symptom of the political complex here. If you are on the side of the government, you will find that you will enjoy quite a level of protection, benefits. But if you are on the side of the opposition, you might find your political career to be quite hard to defend when it comes to greedy politicians trying to consolidate their own power, especially those that are in charge. So I would say that this is a long-standing attitude where if you're the opposition, you are a target. If you are with the government, then you are protected. And it gives a lot of incentive for politicians to jump to other parties for the sake of political survival, or it could be also under the guise of certain threats made by the government to secure your constituents into their camp.
I guess in the Malaysian political sphere, we see that this is a very deep-rooted, I think you can call it a cultural thing amongst our politicians and leaders that drive our nation forward. We see when the new government took over, new government as in the one in 2018, Pakatan Harapan, when they took over, we see not only them going after our former Prime Minister Najib Razak for the many graft and corruption allegations placed against him, but we also see them going after people like Dato Sri Abdul Aziz, who was the former chairman of Tamu Haji. We see them going after politicians like Tengku Adnan Tengku Mansor, who was the Minister of Federal Territories, and as well as many other former government slash UMNO members of parliament. We see this trend happening, like what Ali said previously, we see this trend happening not just in the Pakatan Harapan government, but also in the new Perikatan National government, either dropping these cases of those formerly charged in court, as well as bringing up new cases on those they feel would benefit them politically by placing them under duress by the courts.
So when you have cases of certain politicians being charged for being on the opposite side and certain politicians being acquitted of certain charges because they are conveniently placed within the sphere of governance, it's like I mentioned, an incentive for politicians to change parties for their own survival. And I believe it is a huge detriment to the democratic institutions that we ourselves, Malaysians, have championed for the past 6 years. We pride ourselves on democratic elections and the like. But you can see that our institutions are pretty weak if it's not able to prevent this kind of cultural sentiment or cultural attitudes being precipitated. And I feel that it sets a precedence for politics to come in the future that this is an acceptable practice, especially when it comes to a younger generation coming forward. Some might see that, oh, okay, this is fine practice, as a lot of the older veteran politicians have done so. But I think that it shouldn't be the case. We have to push for more measures that prevents all these kinds of hopping. We need more anti-hopping measures, and I hope that young people will be able to come up with very comprehensive solutions to these issues. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. There are a lot of other inbuilt political cultures within the system of politics here that allows for other shady practices such as graft and corruption, which I think Ryan himself is very vested in this kind of issue. So Ryan, would you like to give us your 2 cents on this whole culture and how it precipitates graft?
So people talk about corruption being only at the highest levels of government. We see this culture of graft being ever present in the media every time we, scroll on Facebook, we flip open the newspaper. We always tend to see articles or news about this politician getting charged in court for this particular corruption scandal or this issue that he embezzled funds and stuff like that. But let's move down the pyramid. Let's go down to the bottom of the pile, which is how corruption has managed to penetrate all levels of society. Well, I don't think that this has ever been mentioned in public before. I mean, we all are aware of this in our own social circles, or we all are aware of this in the back of our minds. But one of the biggest issues of corruption, or one that we face on a daily basis, would be in relation to our public servants. An example of this would be that if you want to get out of a speeding ticket, you happen to use your phone whilst you're driving, even at the red light, and a cop comes to your window. It is more often than not that people bribe their way out of things. Things that we call tweet copy. We give the cop maybe 20, 30 bucks, and he will leave us alone. We don't get a speeding ticket. And these sort of blasé attitudes towards systemic corruption within our society is very troubling indeed. Yes, many Malaysians feel that it is a very normal sentiment. Many Malaysians feel that it is completely fine to bribe a cop because it's a win-win situation for both. You don't get a speeding ticket, and he gets money to spend on maybe his lunch or dinner, or to keep as savings. Because let's face the facts, the only reason why this is happening, not just amongst the police officers, but even some cases in let's say driving institutions, people learn to drive. The only reason why we have corruption happening, or we have bribery taking normalcy within our lives, is because people aren't get paid enough, and institutions aren't strong enough to deal with the issues themselves. So let's talk about the issue of people not getting paid enough. Now, this can also be related to politicians at the highest level, as well as people who are like day-to-day public servants, people like cops, people like driving instructors, and stuff like that. Let's talk about cops. Cops earn a basic salary of 2,005 ringgit a month, and they work long hours. Their jobs aren't easy. They're put in dangerous situations every single day. But frankly, these people aren't paid enough.
I'm pretty sure we know a lot of young people who have been caught speeding or being pulled over by the cops, and we'd always say, it's okay, 50 ringgit, the cops will let me go, and there's no problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Even on the citizen level, I think we also have a part to play in precipitating that kind of culture.
Exactly. And when cops are get paid this little, with no potential of having a raise in their salaries, it's unlike the private sector, in which you get promotions or you get bonuses at the end of the year. It's not like that for our public servants. And when they're put in this situation in which they would have to take up bribes or greed copy to, have a chance at living a comfortable life. I think policy experts or people need to be called in to try to fix this issue in a more systemic level. And let's talk about the higher up politicians who run executive or legislative positions. An MP earns 16,000 ringgit a month, and that excludes the fact that he would have to pay for, his secretary, his political secretaries, political analyst, maybe even his driver, and those costs aren't accounted for by Parliament. In the UK, we see that Parliament does provide for secretaries and political analysts for each individual MPs, and MPs can use these people who are paid by the Parliament to aid them in policy research, to aid them in community outreach, and to improve the ailments that the community faces or the constituents face. We don't see that in Malaysia because, firstly, Parliament isn't sovereign. Parliament gets the budget from the government. And unfortunately, MPs aren't given that luxury to have Parliament deal or pay their staff salaries, and they have to fork it out themselves. And even for top executive positions like, let's say, Prime Minister or even the Minister of, let's say, Youth and Sports, Minister of Agriculture, a ministerial position doesn't earn you as much as it would if you were to be a minister in, let's say, Singapore or the United States or the UK. And Singapore receives a lot of flack for having their prime minister be the most well-paid prime minister in the world. But one thing that founding father of Singapore said was that in order to avoid having your ministers or your MPs being swayed by money, they have to be well paid. They have to live comfortably enough not to be swayed by corruption or graft or bribery. And when we see this happening at the highest levels, yes, people can talk about greed and how politicians are inherently greedy. They only care for themselves. We have to think about the issue, the long-standing issue at hand is that our politicians or our public servants aren't paid well enough. Therefore, they succumb to these temptations of taking money for their own personal use at the expense of the people. We see this happening in 1MDB scandal. Yes, it's a very controversial stance that I'm taking, but our politicians aren't paid well enough. That's why they're committing all these kinds of crimes relating to money. So I don't think we need to touch upon the issue of, let's say, how the public service is run. But what are your thoughts on, let's say, cronyism and political patronage and stuff like that?
That's a good analysis you made on why MPs would do certain things that are considered shady or unfavorable. And I think that would resonate quite a lot with certain cases and examples of some MPs. So perhaps we could take a more comprehensive reform on how we can alleviate some of these challenges and restrictions that members of parliaments and politicians have. But in any case, when it comes to patronage politics and cronyism, I feel that looking back into history in the aftermath of the British decolonialization efforts, the UMNO Party and the Barisan Nasional Party would have to require a lot of consolidation on their front to be able to enact their own policy, because they feel that security of the nation is equal to the security of the regime. So they would do anything to consolidate that kind of power. First, they would use a communist bogeyman during the emergency to shroud certain practices so that they can consolidate their own power. And then later on, they would find themselves being able to use the power of money to be able to attract certain spokespeople or politicians that are able to sway constituencies over to their side. So it's a form of distributive politics funded by party patronage, because we have to know that UMNO and Barisan Nasional had a lot of resources to spare. The ruling regime was able, at the time, to focus on electoral targeting. They were optimizing strategies and tactics to secure electoral victories rather than a basic standard of providing services under the assumption of government responsibility. They would create the illusion that that's the case, but we could see that there were other ulterior motives. In Sabah's case, there were a lot of cases where during the 60s and 70s, when Tun Stephen and Haris Saleh was in the government, we would see a lot of pressure from the federal government to ensure that partners of the Paris national government are able to secure victory. So they would fund the opposition to be able to secure. So it's all an act of consolidating power within the federal government. Because of UMNO's vast resources, it allows to mobilize and distribute resources for political gains in certain constituencies, in strategic targeting of electoral votes to maintain its majority. You help me, I help you. So it influenced a lot of the ruling elite in the BN coalition in procuring electoral mandates in exchange for development and funds for constituency. So from here we could see that because of certain practices passed to be able to secure, you would say, a hegemony on the political sphere, we saw that the ruling elites were willing to mobilize vast amounts of resources to be able to secure loyalties from certain people. And I guess this also manifested in cronyism, because if you are able to if you're able to show your loyalty to the party, you will be rewarded amply, regardless if it's a case of merit or not. They reward based on loyalty to the party and secure the party's interests.
Yes, I think that's a very good point made by Adi. And on relation to political patronage, cronyism, and nepotism in our government, we see this happening in the appointment of GLC heads. GLC is government-linked companies / corporations. We see this happening every time a new administration comes in. We see people being appointed in top GLC positions, not because of their merits, but because of their position or their allegiances to political parties. This creates a culture of yes men, culture of, you must abide by what I say. I expect you to toe the party line. I expect you to toe the line of the Prime Minister and his cabinet. And by putting these people in these positions of governing companies, it not only makes it easier for governments to, pass through legislation or pass through policies in which would require the approval of these leaders in GLCs or these leaders in the branches of government. But it is also very bad in the long term of Malaysia, because we don't have people who are actually qualified to be placed in these positions, and yet we still give them because of, let's say, because of their allegiance to any party. And they're just there to have the checks at the end of the year, the bonuses for being like advisor or chairman to so and so GLC. It is a very controversial topic, I would have to admit, but this is what is happening in Malaysia right now.
So in a way, even the most recent examples you can see is that when certain people were appointed under the Pakatan Harapan administration to certain executive positions, the moment Perikatan Nasional came into the fold of governance, you see that a lot of these executive positions were completely replaced, and a lot of their own people were established into these positions. So, and let's not forget that GLCs are a huge operating arm for the federal government in regards to investment or being able to become authorities for certain industries, act as regulatory bodies such as the Malaysian Communications and Multimedia Commission, which is an operating arm for the Ministry of Communications and Multimedia. So I don't think it's very accountable when they have cabinet positions having operating arms, so they'll only appoint people based on loyalties and rather instead of merit. And these are regulatory bodies. Let's not forget, these will regulate certain regulations within the industry, so they will have quite a strong monopoly and control over the industry. And perhaps in the future we can discuss how these GLCs or federal bodies are able to influence certain developments in the country. I'm talking specifically from federal-state relations, because we can see that when it comes to the relations between the federal and state, I would argue it's extremely centralized to the point that I feel it's very ridiculous and not in the spirit of what we sought out as a federation. But that is another topic entirely. What we're trying to say is that these are very unacceptable practices going forward, because you're not putting the right people in the right positions based on merit. You're putting them because it's able to secure the regime's interest.
But what do you think of political patronage in the sense of not just on a monetary perspective, but favoritism in the government? Because we see this happening favoritism aspect. We see this happening not just in the previous administrations of Barisan National, in which people have lambasted them for nepotism and stuff like that, but we also see it in actually the Pakatan Harapan government in the form of the Council of Eminent Persons or slash Council of Elders. We see that during Tun Dr. Mahathir's second stint in office, the creation of this Council of Elders was with good intentions. He wanted to have these top influential people like Tun Dam Zainuddin, Zeti Aziz, so as Hassan American, Robert Kwok. We see him establishing it so that they could give advice and act as advisors to the government, the newly formed Pakatan Harapan government, on matters specifically related to the economy and financial situation of the country. But we see that, Tun Dam Zainuddin was given a very broad role encompassing a lot of areas, and we see that Tun Dam Zainuddin was exercising powers that should not be exercised by a person that is merely acting as advisor. We see him going to China to negotiate the high-speed rail link projects. We see him being given unprecedented power by the Prime Minister's office to negotiate on behalf of the Malaysian government. And this sort of executive power given to a private citizen who is no longer a member of the government is very much overlooked by the media, but I think it's one thing that we need to address. Now, the culture of this is very bad. It doesn't matter whether the person has taken money or was placed in a position for his or her financial benefit. We see this also happening to people who receive these unprecedented powers, therefore abusing their position to act on behalf of the government. Because at the end of the day, the government or the people who are put in the government are under democracy, and under the definition of democracy, they are elected by the people. People have given them the power to run the country through the social contract, and giving the power to this prime example of Tun Dam Zainuddin in China, the negotiating on the postponement of the high-speed rail is frankly unacceptable.
Oh yeah, I definitely agree. Let's not forget also that Tun Dam Zainuddin was also a very close confidant and advisor of Tun Mahathir. Very long time actually. But it just highlights how those in charge would do anything to secure their own legitimacy and power. And I believe Mahathir has played that very masterfully in trying to insulate himself from some kind of external criticism, and still being able to secure the people that he can trust and people he's able to use for his own interests. But Mahathir is another Titanic figure altogether, and I think he deserves an episode of his own, to be honest. But it goes to show that it really is you help me, I help you kind of scenario. You swear fealty and loyalty to me, then you'll be rewarded regardless of the democratic and the other institutions that we have. You can see that institutions itself are very weak and very porous. It's not really held in high regard to the political culture here.
I mean, that's very well put. I think we can touch on this issue of strengthening institutions in another episode, don't you think, Adi?
Yeah, that's true. But I think we're just laying down the foundations of the problems we have here. These things require an episode altogether. Federal-state relations, Mahathir, solutions to these issues. But with that said, I believe when it comes to the youth population, I think we can both say with certainty that we're quite sick of these practices when it comes to meritocracy being discarded and certain questionable positions being filled up by questionable people. And you could say that there is sort of a slow awakening within the youth population. But I don't feel like their voices are heard enough or amplified enough, because you can see a lot of the politicians that are in charge have been they've been in that kind of position for 20, 30 years. You need fresher outlooks. I think Syed Saddiq was a very good step in the right direction, but you can see now they snubbed him off when he tried to speak out towards more reforms. So I think that a lot of these cultural problems have been really deep set and rooted because politicians have been able to secure and consolidate power to the point that they have held positions for an extremely long time, that this has become a norm. Until there is a fresh new outlook and perspective towards governance and towards more favorable strengthening of our institutions, I will think that this issue will not be resolved, because I feel that we need to start from the ground up. It needs to be a complete paradigm shift in terms of culture, and I think young people has to pave the way forward for it. But that's easier said than done when a lot of the, you see a lot of cases, like I mentioned, Syed Saddiq, youth, he was very popular among the youth electorate. He was seen as a shining beacon, but you can see that he's just cast aside when the moment his use towards these older politicians have no more value. They're only using it to secure young votes, and that's it. That's the only value they see in him, rather than a fresh outlook towards governance.
Well, I guess in a more pessimistic sense, he can be seen as just a token youth member in the Pakatan Harapan government to gain populist votes. Yet again, a very unpopular opinion. But yes, I think Syed Saddiq's policies, which he brought up, especially those on the gig economy, as well as the reformation of the Youth and Sports Ministry and the overall functioning of sports organizations in Malaysia, has been very well ordered, and he should be praised for that. Okay, moving back into the issue of graft, I think it's important for us to understand the implications it will have on us in the future. And even now, the youths or people in Malaysia would see, people like Najib Razak, people like Zahid Hamidi, Tengku Anand, Tengku Mansor, Arukanda, all these people being charged in the court of law for embezzlement of funds or for being complicit towards these embezzlements. I think that it is a very good step for us, because we are firstly aware these things are brought into daylight, being revealed in the courts that so and so has done these sorts of crimes, financial crimes, these sort of stealing money from the people. And as the people and as the populace are more aware of how this social contract between the people and their legislators can be abused, we are heading into the future with a more open mindset, with greater perspective of being more aware of what our politicians do, keeping them even more accountable, shedding more light onto their actions and what they do in the future. And as for the shifting of policy or the fixing of the policies in Malaysia, in which we see so many cracks in, particularly those relating to our public servants, we need to remove corruption through giving them better paid jobs for the things they do. We need to remove nepotism and favoritism, and establishing meritocracy, as what Adi mentioned just now, establishing meritocracy, because we need to have the right people in the right positions to drive our nation forward, not just economically, because I know that most of my points that I've mentioned does relate to the state of Malaysian economy, not just economically, but also for greater social awareness, improving social life in Malaysia. And people can go to say, look, corruption does exist in Malaysia, but society isn't affected. It is very much affected as to how people perceive things. If people start perceiving that law and authority can be bought based on the amount of money you have in the bank, that is a very, very dangerous game to be played. And in the future, if you're not careful, this country could spiral out of control.
All right, in any case, yeah, Brian made a good point in policies to help disincentivize certain practices of corruption. But I think dismantling mentality is also going to be equally important. We can see that political and cultural power is vested strongly with the ruling parties in charge. Now, within the Malaysian political scene rests a distinct hegemonic entity that determines the narrative of politics within Malaysia, whether intentional or unintentional. So I don't think that simply policymaking is the only solution, but rather there has to be a huge systemic and paradigm shift in how we perceive Malaysian politics. So this comes to the youth as a responsibility to be able to precipitate this kind of change, especially on the ground, because I believe politicians such as in the Pakatan Harapan coalition have been harking on certain reforms and practices, but you see that it doesn't matter when it comes to weak institutions and mindsets of political expediency. So this has to be started from the ground up. Awareness has to be spread, as I would recommend. We need to start from the bottom, because I believe our leaders are a reflection of who we are as a citizenry. So we also have a responsibility to take charge and become a responsible citizen in our own right, to be able to practice what we preach and raise awareness on the ground, propagate this message of better reform, systemic reform on the ground. And because at the end of the day, policies made by politicians now will be the ones affected by it. So we have to set policies for our generation. We have to recommend policies for our generation as well that will inherit stewardship and administration, and be ready to let go of stewardship come the next generation of leaders. So, in my opinion, I agree some policy changes are required, but I'm more for a, I think I'm more for a systemic and more radical approach to it. I wouldn't say it's radical, but I wouldn't say radical in the sense like how you can see in America, but there has to be a huge paradigm shift. I agree, there has to be a huge paradigm shift.
So this marks the end of our episode. This is the third episode out of our series A&R Conversations Between Malaysian Youths. Thank you so much to all those tuning in. Be sure to check out our other stuff, and we release episodes every fortnight, so be sure to tune in for those as well. On a side note, be sure to check out Parliament Digital, hosted by Undi 18, and it brings together people from all across Malaysia into an online parliamentary setting for them to discuss issues that are most pertinent towards the youth of Malaysia.
Yes, please do check it out. And I can say with certainty that a lot of the young people involved in this event are very dedicated, very talented, and very passionate to resolving issues such as education, economics, internet, mental health, and so on and so forth. So I believe for people to be able to become more aware of what young people can do is to listen to what young people can do, what they propose. And right, like Ryan said, we will be posting episodes every fortnight. Like we mentioned before, we touched on certain topics that could be the basis of our next episodes, where there could be Mahadirism, federal-state relations, or like I mentioned, the importance of the history of certain things, like how do we get here? How do we get to this kind of system? So maybe a teaser for the next episode is delving into certain historical precedents that led us to where we are now. So we are very excited for more episodes to come. So please tune in. Also, we're both also available on social media. If you are a fan, please please get in touch with us. We're always willing to listen to more constructive feedback. Like I was told, I need better audio quality. So here I am with a new mic. I hope this is actually a much starker improvement from before.
Adi is taking this very seriously, guys.
I'm taking this seriously. I'm scaling up, guys. So I'm doing this for the audience.